James had always trusted his wife, Claire. Their 10-year marriage had seen its share of ups and downs, but James believed their bond was unshakable. They had built a life together filled with laughter, shared dreams, and countless memories. To James, Claire was his anchor, his partner, and his best friend. But one call shattered everything he thought he knew. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the phone rang. James had just settled onto the couch, ready to unwind after a long day at work. Claire was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. The call came from an unknown number, but James answered without hesitation, expecting nothing more than a wrong number or telemarketer. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, deep, and deliberate. "Is this James?" the man asked. "Yes, this is he," James replied cautiously. "I think you need to know what your wife has been up to," the voice said, each word landing like a punch to James's gut. The man introduced himself as Mark, someone Claire had been seeing for months behind James's back. Mark claimed he had no idea Claire was married until recently. The guilt had been eating at him, and he felt James deserved the truth. James's world tilted. His grip on the phone tightened as his mind raced. "You're lying," he said, his voice trembling. Mark sighed, as though he had anticipated the denial. "I'm not. Check her phone. Look for messages from someone named Lila. That's me. She saved my number under a fake name." When the call ended, James sat in silence, staring at the rain streaking down the window. His heart pounded, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of disbelief and anger. He glanced toward the kitchen where Claire stood, her back turned, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Summoning the courage to confront her, James stood and walked into the kitchen. "Who's Lila?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Claire froze, her hand hovering over the stove. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Lila, what are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Claire," James said, his voice rising. "Mark just called me. He told me everything." Claire's face went pale. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of rain hitting the windows. Finally, she whispered, "I can explain." James felt a wave of anger and sadness crash over him. "Explain? How do you explain betraying me? How do you explain destroying everything we built together?" Claire began to cry, but James couldn't tell if it was out of guilt or regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "It started as nothing, just someone to talk to. And then, I don't know. I was lonely, James. You've been so distant lately. Don't you dare blame this on me," James snapped. "I've been working my ass off for us, for this family. And this is how you repay me." Claire's sobs grew louder, but James couldn't bring himself to comfort her. His trust had been shattered, and he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. That night, James slept on the couch, unable to bring himself to share a bed with a woman he no longer recognized. The next morning, he packed a bag and left without a word, needing time and space to decide what came next. Claire's betrayal had cut him deep, and though he wasn't sure if he could forgive her, one thing was certain. That call had changed everything. The life he thought he knew was gone, replaced by a painful new reality he wasn't ready to face. In the days that followed, James stayed with his younger brother, Ryan, who lived a few miles away. Ryan was quick to offer his support, though he didn't press for details. James appreciated the space to think, but the silence only magnified his pain. Memories of Claire flooded his mind, her laughter, the way she used to hold his hand during movies, the quiet mornings they spent sipping coffee together. How had those moments turned into this nightmare? Claire called and texted relentlessly, each message begging for a chance to explain. James ignored most of them, but late one night, after staring at the ceiling for hours, he finally opened one. "Please, James. I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? Just once. I owe you the truth." Against his better judgment, James agreed to meet her. They chose a neutral place, a small coffee shop where they had once celebrated their anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on him. When Claire arrived, her eyes were puffy, and she looked as though she hadn't slept in days. She sat across from him, fiddling with the bracelet he had bought her years ago. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Claire began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry." James leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Why, Claire? I need to know why." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "It wasn't about you. It wasn't because you did something wrong. It was me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. And then Mark, he noticed me. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. But it was a mistake, James. I see that now." James shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You should have come to me, Claire. You should have told me how you felt instead of running to someone else." "I know," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was selfish and stupid. I don't want to lose you. Please, James, tell me what I can do to make this right." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. James wanted to believe her, to believe that their marriage could survive this. But the wound was still fresh, and trust, once broken, wasn't easily mended. "I don't know if we can come back from this," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You didn't just betray me, Claire. You betrayed us. Everything we built together." Claire reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched his. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything. Please, James. I love you." James pulled his hand away, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "I need time, Claire. And so do you. To figure out if this is about saving us or saving your guilt." He stood, leaving Claire sobbing at the table. As he walked out into the cool evening air, James felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The days turned into weeks, and James threw himself into his work, trying to find clarity in the chaos. He and Claire attended a few therapy sessions together, but the sessions were fraught with tension. For every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. One evening, after another grueling session, James sat alone in his apartment, staring at an old photo of him and Claire on their honeymoon. They looked so happy, so in love. But now, that love felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the pain of betrayal. Claire had been making every effort to rebuild his trust, from cutting off contact with Mark to being completely transparent about her whereabouts and feelings. But was it enough? Could love alone heal the deep scars left by her actions? James knew he had a choice to make: hold on to the anger and let it consume him, or take a leap of faith and try to rebuild what they had lost. Neither path was easy, but he couldn't stay in limbo forever. As he picked up the phone to call Claire, his hand trembled. No matter what happened next, one thing was clear: his life had been irrevocably changed. And now, it was up to him to decide what that change would mean. Claire answered on the first ring. Her voice was soft, tentative, as though she was afraid of what James might say. "James," she whispered. He hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Can you come over?" he asked. "Of course," she replied immediately, her voice trembling with what sounded like relief. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Claire arrived, James opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked different, worn down by guilt, remorse etched into her every expression. He gestured for her to come inside, and she stepped in cautiously, like a guest in a stranger's home. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them stretching out uncomfortably. Finally, James broke it. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything, about us." Claire nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And," James sighed, running a hand through his hair, "I'm angry, Claire. I'm hurt. I feel like I don't even know you anymore. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about what we've been through together. I don't want to throw it all away without trying to fix it, but I need to know if you're truly willing to do the work, to rebuild this from the ground up. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded emphatically. I am. I'll do whatever it takes, James. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I promise you, I'll prove that I'm worth it. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. This isn't going to be easy. Trust doesn't just come back overnight. And honestly, there's a part of me that wonders if it ever will. Claire wiped her tears, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. I understand. I'm not expecting forgiveness right away. I want the chance to earn it, to show you that I can be the wife you deserve. James nodded slowly. Then we start with boundaries. Complete honesty, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Therapy. And if I ever feel like you're not fully committed, Claire, I won't hesitate to walk away. I agree, she said quickly, her voice filled with determination. I'll do all of that, and more, if that's what it takes. Over the next few weeks, they began the painstaking process of rebuilding their relationship. Therapy sessions became a regular part of their routine, where they confronted not only the affair, but the cracks in their marriage that had been ignored for years. James learned to express the resentment he had buried, while Claire confronted the insecurities and loneliness that had driven her actions. It wasn't a smooth road. There were arguments, moments when James questioned why he was even trying, and nights when Claire cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by guilt. But amidst the chaos, there were glimmers of hope, small moments where they rediscovered the connection that had once defined their relationship. One evening, as they sat on the couch together after a particularly difficult therapy session, Claire reached for James's hand. He hesitated, then let her fingers intertwine with his. I know I've said this before, but I need you to hear it again, she said, her voice steady. I love you, James. I never stopped loving you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I've caused you. James looked at her, his expression softening. I believe you, he said quietly, and I'm starting to believe that maybe we can get through this. But it's going to take time, Claire. A lot of time. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. I'm not going anywhere. Months later, they sat together in their therapist's office for what had become a routine session. Their counselor smiled at them warmly. You've come a long way, she said. It's clear that you both want this to work, and you're putting in effort to make it happen. That's more than many couples can say. As they walked out of the office, James glanced at Claire, her hand nestled in his. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. Not just for their marriage, but for the life they were slowly rebuilding together. One call had changed everything, but it didn't have to be the end. It could be the beginning of something new, something stronger. And for the first time in months, James believed that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through. The progress Claire and James had made wasn't without its challenges, but it was undeniable. Slowly, James began to see glimmers of the woman he had fallen in love with, and Claire saw the man she once feared she'd lost. They both learned that rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating a future that could endure the pain they had suffered. One Saturday morning, James sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands as he watched the sun rise. Claire joined him, her hands wrapped around her own mug, a tentative smile on her lips. They hadn't spoken much that morning, but the silence between them felt less oppressive now. Do you ever think we'll get back to how we were? She asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. James took a long sip of his coffee, considering her question. No, he said honestly, but maybe that's not the goal. We can't go back, Claire. Too much has happened, but we can try to create something different, something better. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. I want that too. The journey to something better wasn't linear. James still had moments where doubt crept in, where a certain phrase or look would trigger memories of the betrayal. On one such evening, they were folding laundry together when James noticed Claire's phone buzzing on the counter. Instinctively, his chest tightened. Claire noticed his reaction and walked over to the phone, picking it up and holding it out to him. "It's just my mom," she said softly. "But if you ever want to check, you can. No passwords. No secrets." James hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I don't want to live like that. But I appreciate that you're willing to be open." These moments of transparency began to outweigh the lingering tension. Trust, fragile but growing, started to take root again. Claire's actions consistently matched her words. She showed up for every therapy session, communicated openly, and prioritized James in ways she hadn't in years. Months turned into a year, and James and Claire decided to take a step they hadn't considered possible: renewing their vows. It was Claire's idea, a way to mark their commitment to starting fresh, and James, though hesitant at first, eventually agreed. On a crisp autumn day, in a small ceremony with only their closest friends and family, they stood beneath a canopy of golden leaves and spoke words they had crafted together. "James," Claire began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I made a promise to you once, and I broke it. But standing here today, I vow to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worthy of your love and trust. You are my heart, my home, and I will never take that for granted again." James took a deep breath, looking at the woman who had hurt him, but also the woman who had fought to make amends. "Claire, we've been through hell, and there were times I didn't think we'd make it. But we're still here. I promise to keep fighting for us, to never stop communicating, and to trust that the love we're rebuilding is strong enough to carry us forward." As they exchanged rings once more, James felt something shift. It wasn't a return to the way things used to be. It was the beginning of something new, something hard-won and undeniably real. That night, as they danced in the glow of string lights strung across their backyard, James held Claire close. The scars of their past would never completely fade, but they were no longer raw wounds. They were reminders of how far they had come, and how much further they could go. In the quiet of that moment, James realized something profound. The call that had once shattered his world had also forced them to confront what they had taken for granted. It hadn't just changed everything, it had saved them in its own painful, transformative way.